I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that the Central Library and all of its branches are located on the colonized and settled lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Christopher is a professor of modern Chinese literature in the Department of Asian Studies at UBC. He's translated English subtitles for over 20 early Chinese films, which may be watched for free on YouTube and on ChineseFilmClassics.org. In early 2021, Columbia University Press will publish Professor Rea's next book, Chinese Film Classics.
Thanks very much, Morgan. Thanks, Diane, Brodus, Candy. This is actually the second talk that I'm doing on Bruce Lee. We did one, same content, but in Mandarin. And one thing that I've discovered when talking about Bruce Lee, I've taught him in a couple of UBC courses. Some people have heard of Bruce Lee, but actually haven't seen his films. So I'm assuming that if you're here tonight, you've heard of him. You are partly attracted by his image, by his celebrity, but are kind of wondering, why is Bruce Lee still important? So we'll talk a bit about Bruce Lee himself, but I think especially about how he's resonated with a variety of different people. He supposedly made his own first screen debut as an infant. As an adult, he was this larger-than-life presence, and a lot of people really identified with what they saw in his films. And I wanted to talk about this history kind of through a few films, including this documentary, I Am Bruce Lee. And I want to also draw a contrast when we're talking about him acting, to talk about like how he innovated this form of the Kung Fu film by comparing some of his works to what came right before. I think that kind of his legendary status is really due to the audience reaction to him. And I want to highlight one community in particular, which is the African-American community, because this is a community that I think has had an outsized influence on turning Bruce Lee from just another Kung Fu or martial arts screen star into a legend. And so I thought we could look at some clips from some of his films, as well as films that he inspired, right? Things that are kind of downstream within this cultural production sphere. And then I think there have been some afterlives, right? Some very degraded copies of Bruce Lee that we've seen, but also works that deal with the legend and deal how legends can kind of grow stale and become cliche, but they can also be renewed in really interesting ways. So I think the basic question we're dealing with tonight is what made Bruce Lee any different from anybody else, right? China's had films since the 1890s. The first so-called Chinese-made film was from 1905. It's called Ding Jun Shan, or Conquering Jun Mountain. And it is known as an opera film. It was a stage performance by a well-known Chinese opera star. But actually, since it was a silent film, we don't hear any singing. The evidence that's been left behind suggests that what we do see is fighting. So one of the very first Chinese films was actually a fighting film. And then we had this huge wave of martial arts films in the 1920s, and then just generation after generation, before you get to the late 60s and early 70s, the 1971 in particular, when Bruce Lee burst onto the scene. So I think this question could be asked about the man, about the actor, about his films, and about his kind of iconic status while still alive, and then the legendary status he has achieved posthumously. So here are the films. The Big Boss, Fist of Fury. Big Boss is sometimes also known as Fists of Fury, which is extremely confusing. Enter the Dragon. Before that, The Way of the Dragon, which is significant as a film that Bruce Lee wrote, directed, and starred in himself. And then there's Game of Death, which was completed after his death. That's not a lot of films. Jackie Chan has acted in over 120 films. He's directed a bunch. You think about the sheer volume of text created, right? The sheer volume of images created. The fact that Bruce Lee could produce so little but become such a huge star really says something. And I think that is the first way that I would say that Bruce Lee is different from a lot of the other people who preceded and followed him. Is he didn't produce very much. And so we have a very small canon of Bruce Lee works. He did some interviews, he did a little bit of writing, but there are a lot of people who speak for Bruce Lee, and I'm of course one of them. But I thought we could start by taking a look at a clip from this documentary, which was approved by Bruce Lee's family and descendants, and see what some of the fans say. So this is how the film starts.
If someone says I can't watch a Bruce Lee film, then I can't talk to him.
Bruce Lee is a worldwide fighting icon.
It was a 130-something pound lethal weapon.
Bruce and his fighting style changed the game.
In the beginning, I had no intention that what I was practicing and what I'm still practicing now would lead to this.
Bruce Lee, Bob Dylan, Ali, Jay-Z, Tiger, Kobe, Jordan, they all have the same spirit.
No stunt coordinator coordinated his shit. He did it himself.
The guy you see in Bruce's films is the way Bruce was in person.
He could lose his temper.
Bruce Lee is my idol.
He was directing, writing, acting.
I don't even look at him as being Asian. He's like Bruce Lee. He's like my idol.
When you think of Bruce Lee, you don't think about the Asian karate guy. You think about a legacy.
The moves that he could do, when you were wondering if they were speeding up the camera.
Bruce Lee was like the superhero of the Asian community.
You had Muhammad Ali. You had Malcolm X. Bruce Lee represented that same kind of radicalism.
Technically brilliant choreography. You get mysticism, you get hyper-masculinity. This guy is like, bang.
He's putting balls on Chinese men.
That's some cool stuff right there.
You're like, wow, that super cool guy is my dad.
And there'll never be another Bruce Lee.
Baby, here I am. How does a small Chinese guy become the greatest martial artist of all time?
Production 263-05-224-10, test X1. Take one, Steve.
Now, Bruce, just look right into the camera lens right here and tell us your name, your age, and where you were born.
My last name is Lee, Bruce Lee. I was born in San Francisco in 1940. I'm 24 right now.
Bruce Lee is presented as kind of the total package, right? You know, he's both Asian, but he also kind of transcends Asianness. He's got that swagger that comes across in even just a few split seconds. All these people are kind of testifying what Bruce Lee means to them. It does show that Bruce Lee really connected, right? He connected with a lot of people. Born in the US, so he's American. He was raised in Hong Kong, so he has a very strong Hong Kong connection, right? He's bilingual. He began his acting career very young. Some people don't know that he was kind of a child actor as well. But he moved to the United States as a teenager and attended the University of Washington. And, you know, part of the story is that he was getting in a lot of street fights. And, you know, if you fight the wrong person or connected with a triad, you may end up dead. So best to move to a safer place like Seattle. So he moves to Seattle. He majors in drama at the University of Washington. Sometimes he would claim that he majored in philosophy, but that's not what UW tells us. He met his wife there, but soon after graduation, he got involved in television. He had his childhood career, but his kind of adult career was relatively short, right? Ending with his death in Hong Kong in 1973. His son, Brandon Lee, also died in the midst of shooting a movie. So he himself became a movie star, but like his father, died under rather mysterious circumstances. He was supposedly shot while on set of The Crow. And so this movie was released after his death. You had a kind of body double appearing in some scenes, and it seemed uncannily similar to what had happened with Bruce Lee, who was shooting a movie, and then we have this unfinished movie with a body double in it. And his family is absolutely sick of answering questions about, like, is there some family curse? Whatever the facts may be, this does contribute to this kind of aura and this legend surrounding the figure. He founded martial arts schools, but this was one that's very eclectic and drew on many different traditions. And so he said, you know, I really don't believe in there being one style. Like, you should take the best from everything. In the late 1960s, he became a TV actor, so that screen test that we just saw at the end of the documentary clip was from Charlie Chan's number one son. If, like me, you watch old films, you'll know that Charlie Chan was this pulp fiction Chinese detective figure who, was in pulp literature. There were films with like whiteface actors, and then you had Key Luke appearing as the number one son. I don't think this particular show was produced, but the breakthrough role on TV that helped lead to this later film career was Kato in The Green Hornet. So he's kind of the sidekick figure. I think it only had one season or something. But what Bruce Lee found when he went to Hong Kong is that everybody thought that the show was about Kato, not about the Green Hornet. His figure completely upstaged the star and the titular hero of this series. And so this was kind of his entryway to working with producers and major filmmakers. So in 1971, we have the first Bruce Lee film, and this was an overnight sensation. If you look at all the 5 films that I mentioned earlier, and you just look at the money side, they were phenomenally profitable films. And so I think one of the reasons there's been so much interest in Bruce Lee from the beginning is because he made a lot of people a lot of money. He didn't make himself very much money for the big boss. I think his paycheck was rather small for that. But by the time you get to The Way of the Dragon, right, he's got a lot more artistic control. He doesn't have to deal with some of those big personalities from the Hong Kong industry and the like. He's putting in more choreography. He had really established himself immediately as a bankable star. So his charisma, his martial arts skill, and his comedy and dramatic skill. If you're interested in his comic side, The Way of the Dragon is a very good one to check out. There's a lot of gags in there. I mentioned that one of the things that I think contributes to his legend is, of course, the film texts themselves. And if you look at films like Fist of Fury or Enter the Dragon, there are some things that are not necessarily connected to Bruce Lee himself. Some of the cinematography, the camera angles, the way that the shots are framed, the kind of props like the use of mirrors is absolutely fantastic. And it kind of complements the bodily performance. I'm not going to say too much about the filmic quality of his works since we're focused on the man and his audience, but I do think that that's an important part of the story and kind of this legendary status, and that you see people again and again trying to recreate iconic scenes from the film. This is a larger-than-life figure, even though he was only 135 pounds. This is a short, lightweight, but you look at his body and you realize he is a force to be reckoned with. So Bruce Lee is, of course, not the inventor of Kung Fu cinema, but I wanted to look at an example of how he really changed the look and feel of it. Just to give an example of how he's part of a lineage, if you just look at the Chinese title of a film from 1970 starring Wang Yu, the Chinese boxer. So Wang Yu was an established star who had appeared in a bunch of Shaw Brothers martial arts film. Then we have Enter the Dragon a few years later. And the title in Chinese is very, very similar, right? There's only one character of difference. So let's take a look at The One-Armed Swordsman. This is a huge box office smash in 1967 in Hong Kong, mostly shot on a studio set, lush color, lush cinematography, a lot of gimmicks as well, a lot of gimmick weapons, and the gimmick of having the swordsman fighting with only one arm. It's a very, very short clip. You don't get the major fight scenes or the chopping off of the arm. This is the magic palm sequence. There's some humor. You have these kind of charismatic leads, a lot of medium close-ups and the like, and also supernatural stuff. So there is a certain degree of fakeness to the sets and to some of the stunts. Whereas for Bruce Lee, one of the things that he really embodied was this kind of authentic physicality. Like he really was in great shape. And I think this was part of the model that he changed, is that we're no longer satisfied with camera tricks and supernatural stuff. Like we want people who are actually can throw a punch and take a punch. And so Jackie Chan, I think, is following in this vein. He also got a start in the 1970s, so he became a star then. And so one of the things that Jackie Chan and his publicity team keep emphasizing is that he really does his own stunts. And this is one of the reasons we should watch him, right? Because there's nothing fake going on here. So there's a real bodily commitment there. Let's take a look at a very interesting moment. The Game of Death begins in a very bizarre way with a clip from Way of the Dragon. It'll give you a sense of the Bruce Lee style fighting. We had 2 films in one. You can tell which are the versions from Way of the Dragon, and then the shots of the film crew shooting that scene. And so in Game of Death, you have this very bizarre structure where it begins with footage of the actual Bruce Lee. It ends with several scenes of the actual Bruce Lee. But in between, you have like a fake Bruce Lee or Bruce Lee imitator. You have fandom being represented in Bruce Lee films in really interesting ways. And I'll give a few more examples in a minute. So what is the difference between, say, a Wang Yu type character and the Bruce Lee type character? It's been summed up often as being that Wang Yu was an actor who played a martial arts expert, whereas Bruce Lee was an actual martial arts expert who acted. So this was kind of a fundamental difference between the 2 styles. And this has been followed with figures like Jackie Chan, of course, Jet Li, right? He actually was a martial arts champion in China before turning his career towards filmmaking. Another thing that we get in Bruce Lee films that I think has added to his aura is that the bodily fighting and the training and the self-conditioning is often talked about as being a philosophy. And so in Enter the Dragon, for example, there's one sequence where he's dealing with a bully on a boat. They're all going to be contestants at a martial arts competition on an island. This guy keeps trying to pick a fight with him, this racist white guy. And so Bruce Lee is eventually, okay, fine, let's spar. The white guy goes down first, and then Bruce Lee just lets out the line. So the guy's in this leaky boat.
The art of fighting without fighting.
This is a principle drawn from the art of war. That is the best way to win a battle, is to not have to throw a punch. Bruce Lee, when he kind of talked about his own work, would often speak in these terms. And the ideas are not necessarily original, but the expression of them often was in his films. And he often talked about martial arts itself as the ultimate form of self-expression. It was not about punches and kicks, and it was not about styles, but it was about finding your authentic self and expressing it. So one of the ways he expressed it was through screams, these kind of primal screams. So it wasn't just the body, you also have the voice. One of the things that all Bruce Lee fans will do, you can mimic him. You don't know Chinese, or maybe you don't want to imitate his accent, but you can do the scream. So you get a lot of people identifying and emulating through the screams. And again, there's this bodily commitment. So in a lot of the plots of these films, he takes a beating, and at the end of Fist of Fury, he makes the ultimate sacrifice, leaping towards the camera.